Well, I want to welcome you again to our live stream here at the Bridge Church on Easter Sunday. My name's Craig. I'm the lead pastor here at the church. I'm really glad that you've joined us this morning. And I want to start this morning just by kind of naming our reality at this moment. I would not blame you if you came here this morning perhaps feeling a sense of hopelessness. Actually, given our current circumstances. We are over a year into this pandemic. This is now our second pandemic Easter. I remember last year kind of thinking, I really hope we can get back in time for Easter 2020. And we're not there 1 year later. Vaccines were supposed to be kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. But now we've got these variants that are spreading, that are more transmissible, more dangerous, perhaps resistant to some extent to vaccines, and so that's kind of scary. We have restrictions that we're starting to maybe ease off. We were given, as churches, we were given permission to hold super exciting services where nobody was allowed to talk to each other or even sing, but even that got taken away, and so you have this sense that maybe things are going to change, things are going to improve right around the corner, but all of a sudden numbers are rising again, and you've got like this third wave, and if you're like me, you just kind of wish that you could travel into the future and see where is this going to end, Like to be able to go 20 years from now and be like, are people still wearing masks? Is there some end to this in sight? Are we almost there, or is it years away? Like you have no idea, And in the meantime, this whole staying apart and doing everything on Zoom, everything digital, it starts to get a little bit old, doesn't it? So we kind of tire of these things, right? And for me, I feel it most acutely when it comes to our church community. I long for us, and I know I say this often, but I long for us to be back together again. I long for community groups to be able to eat together and study the Bible together and laugh together. I long for us to be gathered and singing our hearts out to God. I miss that so much. I lament that. And I was on a prayer walk. I always, every Saturday night, I go for a prayer walk, unless it's like this crazy North Vancouver dump of rain. And I'm in the Maplewood area a couple weeks ago. I'm walking around, and sometimes I pray out loud, and I'm always kind of worried that someone's going to come around the corner and hear me and think that I'm crazy, but I do it anyways. And I'm praying, and I'm just lamenting this, right? And just feeling like almost like despairing, like, are we ever going to get there again? And the thought hits me. Of course we will. With certainty. We will come to the place where we can shake hands and do those awkward side hugs, and some of us the full-on embraces, and laugh right in each other's faces and sing with our whole hearts to God. We will absolutely, certainly get there. Now, what I don't know for sure is if it will happen in my lifetime or not. I would hope it will. I think so. But what I know for sure is that a day is coming when this will be the case in God's eternity, in heaven, that all of these things that I long for, that I crave, will be, these longings will be satisfied. I don't need to fear that I will never experience that again. I will. And that thought gave me some joy, more than it usually does. It gave me a little bit of a boost to say, no, I can hold on to hope. And here's what I get from that the promise of the future empowers endurance in the present, even in difficult circumstances. Now, if you're new with us or haven't been with us for a while, I'll let you know, we've been going through the Old Testament book of Isaiah, the last part of Isaiah. And just a side note about that, here at the Bridge, we're big on the Bible. We know it's not culturally trendy to think that a 2,000-year-old plus text has some relevance to our modern world, but we believe it. In fact, we have seen again and again evidence of changed lives and changed hearts because of this book. In fact, we believe that this book, rightly understood, is not only relevant to our modern day, but is actually God's word, communicating his truth, his perspective to us. And as such, it is indispensable. It's something we've got to dig into, something we want to set our focus on. And so if you're new to all of this, I hope you'll bear with me and give the Bible a hearing as well. This part of Isaiah, written in the context of, or at least written to probably a group of people, Jewish people in exile. So they've been oppressed, they've been afflicted, and Isaiah writes these words of hope, of good news in this context. Now, last week, and the last couple weeks actually, we've looked at God's salvation for his people being embodied in someone Isaiah calls the servant of the Lord. And the servant, according to Isaiah 53, is going to be ridiculed and despised and abhorred. He's going to have his form marred, his appearance disfigured. It's just this cascade of hardship. And as we saw last week, it actually fits the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels like a glove. Now, there's an interesting thing from Isaiah 53 is that the servant undergoes all of this willingly. It's like his choice. Isaiah 52:13 starts out by saying, "See, my servant will act wisely." The implication being that everything that comes afterwards, all of this suffering and pain, is actually because of choices, wise choices, by this servant figure. We read about how the servant takes up our pain and bears our suffering, bears our pain. And that is active language that the servant chooses to do that. I mean, how many of us would do that? If we were given a choice, if we were told, okay, you can go down this road and it's going to be a lot of pain, or you can go down this road and it's going to be fine, how many of us willingly choose that path of pain and suffering? That's what the servant did. See, Isaiah 53 is not intended to make us feel sorry for the servant because he's a victim, because of poor circumstances. And I was thinking about this, and I remembered an episode from Seinfeld. This isn't like a commendation of the show or anything like that, but there was an episode where George Costanza is applying for an apartment, and the committee that's going to decide who gets the apartment, for whatever reason, they're gonna give it to whoever suffered the most. And George finds out that there's a survivor of a famous shipwreck who's applying. And he's distraught at first. Oh, I'm not going to get this apartment. But then he realizes that he can tell his life story in a way that will make anyone feel sympathy for him. And so he goes in there, and it's like the Olympics of suffering. He just pours all his misfortune out to them, and they're weeping, they're bawling. He wins the Olympics of suffering. Doesn't get the apartment because that kind of thing doesn't happen to George Costanza. But in any case, that's not what the servant of the Lord is like. He's not a victim of poor circumstances. He voluntarily, willingly undergoes all of this. The question is why? Why would the servant do that? And to help us get into that, here's Daniel and Carol giving us the last few verses of Isaiah 53.
Happy Easter from Mexico.
Felices Pascuas. Reading from Isaiah 53, verses 10 to 12. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressor.
So why does the servant undergo this suffering? Verse 10 says it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. Now, at first glance, out of context, that sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? It sounds like God is sadistic, that he enjoys putting people through the ringer. But in context, that's not at all what's going on, because we're told again and again in this passage, including in these few verses, that the servant undergoes all of this, takes the punishment actually that we deserved. He bears our pain and our suffering so that we can be set free. So it's actually because of God's grace and his mercy towards us that the servant bears what is ours to bear, and he takes it off of us so that we can be set free. And aside from that, there's also the important recognition that if the servant is fulfilled in Jesus in the New Testament, that he's not just a human being, he's more than that. That actually God, through the Son of God, came and bore our suffering. It's not that God is distant or detached from this. So the servant undergoes his suffering because it's the Lord's will and he's obedient. He does it willingly and voluntarily, though, because of love, because of mercy. But there's another reason here in Isaiah 53 that the servant undergoes all of this. If you caught it, the last part of verse 10, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. He will be satisfied. Does that not sound like there is something after death? That there is some kind of vindication. His days are going to be prolonged. He's going to continue to execute God's will. He's going to see his descendants, which does not, by the way, mean like the Da Vinci Code apparently thinks it means. There's a 20-year-old pop culture reference right there, that Jesus had biological descendants, but rather that he has a people. The servant has a people formed to himself. Isaiah 54, the very next chapter, talks about how the children of a barren woman, a desolate woman, are more than the one who has a husband, as in there are ways to have children, to have a people other than biologically. Could it be that the servant knows that this is going to happen, that despite being despised and abhorred in the present time, that a time is coming when there will be a people, his people, created and formed. He is going to see his days prolonged. He is going to be satisfied by what happens afterwards. In other words, could it be that the servant is empowered to endure in the present because of the promise of the future? And we said last week in Isaiah 53, it's really hard not to connect that passage with Jesus. And what's implied here about the servant is made clear about Jesus in the New Testament. And I want to share with you a passage from Hebrews chapter 12. Now, Hebrews, just as a bit of context, Hebrews is a letter written to Christians who are struggling. And actually, most of the Bible, by the way, is written, like Isaiah written in the context of exile, Hebrews written in the context of struggling churches. Most of the Bible is written in situations like this. So if your life isn't perfect and peachy and keen, the Bible's a good book for you. Hebrews written to Christians who are being persecuted. They're being mocked and ridiculed. Some of them have had their property confiscated. Some have been thrown into prison because of their faith in Jesus. And so they're getting discouraged. They're tempted to stop meeting together. And how many of you have experienced that temptation this year to even the temptation not to meet even digitally in this kind of way? I mean, I was on Friday, the Good Friday service, we pre-recorded it, so I was at home. And I've experienced this a few times, but when I'm at home and I just realized, like on a Sunday morning, it's really hard. If you have young kids, to actually pay attention and be present. I mean, you're kind of like, what's the point? I got these kids crying and begging for things. I can't even hear what's going on. So there's this temptation to just say, what's the point? This is just give up. Put this off for now. And it's in that context, a context that we can very much relate to, that the author of Hebrews speaks these words of encouragement. Here's Daniel and Carol again from Hebrews 12, 1-3.
Hebrews 12, verses 1-3. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted.
It's a loaded passage and a lot there that we could talk about, but I want to make two things clear. One is that the author of Hebrews' words are intended to encourage his readers, intended to empower them to keep going, not lose heart, not grow weary, but to keep going. And his particular encouragement is to look to Jesus, to look to the one who also experienced hardship and opposition and endured it. The author says that Jesus endured the cross. Why? For the joy set before him. His vindication, his victory, his being seated at the right hand of the throne of God. What the word that Hebrews doesn't use, but that is clear here, is resurrection. It was for the joy set before him, the victory over death, that Jesus was able to endure the suffering of the cross. See, Jesus knew this. He knew this from the start, that the cross would not be the final word, that his suffering and his pain was not the end of the story, but that there was something else. Again and again, he tells the disciples in the Gospels, look, this is what's going to happen to me. I am going to be handed over. I am going to be killed, but I will rise from the dead. He knew this. And then after the resurrection, he was like, guys, I told you this. I told you this would happen. Well, you've probably experienced this, right? Sometimes I'm like, Carolyn, you never told me this. And she's like, I told you 5 times already. What are you talking about? So you've experienced this. Jesus knew it. He told them again and again, this is what's going to happen. And this knowledge, this sure and certain knowledge of what was to come, empowered Jesus to keep going through the hardship. I know I'm making the same point again and again here. The promise of the future empowers us to endure in the present. And it's not a point that's unique to the Bible either, because we see it in the world all around us. I mean, if you're here in British Columbia, we've heard this from our provincial health leaders, from Bonnie Henry and Adrian Dix, who have used this as their primary messaging strategy. I have to give them credit. They have not resorted to fear nearly as much as they have tried to motivate people with this promise of what is to come. They're always saying, look, we just got to go a little bit more. Just stay apart a little bit longer. Follow these measures. We're almost there. The light is at the end of the tunnel. Just keep going. And again, I just think about how we use this strategy in my home as well. And so here come the kids. Now, advance warning here. We usually script it out. Like we were like, hey, this is what we're going to say. This time I thought I'd just catch them unexpected. And so anyways, they were eating lunch yesterday. It was food that they usually aren't very excited about. And this is what they said. Excited about that food? You are? Natalie, are you excited about that food?
Yes!
What? You guys really? Come on, I've heard you complain about this food before. Right?
Guys, we got to eat chocolate!
Oh, is that why you like the food? Because you get to eat chocolate afterwards? Yeah? Natalie, is that the motivation? Because you get to eat chocolate afterwards? Zachary, is that why you're going to do it?
Yeah.
Okay. So you'll eat chicken and rice and tomatoes if there's chocolate to come afterwards. By the way, Carolyn is a really good cook. That food is really good. Happy birthday, Carolyn. Love you so much. So yeah, enduring the promise of the future enduring the present because of the promise of the future. We see that around us. Now here's the issue though. What happens if you start to doubt that future is actually on the way? What if you are told put your head down, keep going. We're almost there. It's just around the corner. But every time you turn the corner, there's another corner and another corner and another corner. What if the goalpost keeps getting moved? I was talking to a friend here at the bridge who was telling me that he did one of those crazy obstacle course races years ago. And I can't remember exactly. I think it was something like 9 kilometers. That's what they were told. That's what they were prepared for. And they're doing it like it takes everything you've got. And then they get almost to the finish line, and all of a sudden the organizers of the race pull one on them. And they go, oh, actually, this is not the finish line. You've got another, whatever it was, like 6 kilometers more. And they totally detour them. And my friend was saying this was so thoroughly discouraging because you had prepared, you had trained, you were ready for this to be the finish line. And then all of a sudden there's this whole additional piece. And, and so many people dropped out of the race at that point. And I think that is kind of what's happening right now with this pandemic fatigue, is that we've been told again and again and again, it's right there, it's right around the corner. And every time you turn the corner, there's another wrench that gets thrown into the mix. It gets put off again. Oh, it's just a 2 or 3 week kind of thing, but it never is. And you start to lose heart. You start to grow weary because that future is never actually arriving in the present. So we said that the promise of the future empowers endurance in the present. We could also say this, that the promise of the future loses its power when we doubt its certainty. And maybe you actually feel that way about God as well. Maybe you feel like you have tried to keep up your end of the deal, and you're not sure that God has kept up his. That you've asked for things in prayer and you haven't received, and you're left wondering, God, can I really trust your promises? But see, this is actually what sets the gospel and sets the Easter message apart. Because it's not, in the end, a wished-for hope that we have no basis for really trusting. It is a promise that has actually come into the present. The historical resurrection of Jesus makes the promise of the future certain. Now let me explain that a little bit. The historical resurrection of Jesus makes the promise of the future certain. I say that because the resurrection of Jesus is not just a one-time random occurrence in history, but according to the Bible, it is a promise of what will happen to all who trust in him. It is a sign, a guarantee that has come into the present. This is what's going to take place for all who trust in him. Now, to establish that, I first need to establish that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. And so I want to do something that I do every single Easter. In fact, if you were to look back last Easter, I think I was even maybe wearing the same shirt. You could basically just copy and paste what I said then and put it here for the next few minutes. But I need to say again and again that the resurrection of Jesus is not a metaphor. It is not like a symbol of the warm, fuzzy feeling we get at springtime when the green leaves show up on the trees again, as much as we love this season of year. The resurrection of Jesus is a historical, physical, bodily event. And to get at that, here's Daniel and Carol one more time from 1 Corinthians 15. Now, they said earlier, they're doing this from Mexico, from the warmth of the sun in Mexico, which I feel is kind of like the potential promise of the future for some of us into the present. We're like, yeah, maybe that's possible that we could actually, leave these northern lands. But anyways, here's 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8.
And from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-8. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12.
Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me.
So here's Paul writing words to the Corinthian Christians who actually are doubting the certainty of their own resurrection. And so to address that, Paul goes back to Jesus' resurrection. He goes back to the past to assure them of what is to come. And he has this list of people who he says have seen the risen Jesus. He says, look, there are all these eyewitnesses. I can point you in their direction. I can tell you who they are. Now, what do we do with that list? This is actually some interesting evidence in terms of the historical reality of the resurrection. Because what do you do with this? You could say that all of these people saw some kind of vision, some hallucination even. It wasn't a real physical thing. They just it was in their heads. But it happens to so many people at different times. It's not like one event. It's like a whole bunch of different events. And if you think it was just wishful thinking that they just really, really wanted Jesus to be alive, and so they conjured this up, you need to know that there was no expectation in first century Judaism of a resurrection in the middle of history. That one person would conquer death in the middle of history wasn't something that anyone was kind of expecting. And in fact, there were lots of other movements around messiahs, would-be messiahs, where the Messiah was killed by the Romans. And in none of those other situations did anyone start going, yeah, but our Messiah actually rose from the dead. It never happened. There was no precedence for this in first century Judaism. Probably not wishful thinking, not a vision. What if they were just lying? What if all these people colluded? They came together and said, let's come up with a great story about Jesus rising from the dead. The issue there is, what would they have gotten out of it? I'll tell you what they did get out of it. Death. Mostly, almost all the apostles died, were killed for their proclamation that Jesus had risen from the dead. These are a group of guys who were locked behind doors after Jesus' crucifixion because they were next. They were scared. They were chicken. And yet all of a sudden, something happens to send them out telling everybody that Jesus has bodily, physically risen from the dead at the cost of their lives. Think about Paul. Paul was a persecutor of the church. He was on the right side of history. He had the power behind him from culture, from the government, to suppress these ridiculous claims of Christians. He was on that side. And then all of a sudden, he does a 180. He's going around the Mediterranean world, subjecting himself to an Olympics of suffering that would surpass even George Costanza, telling people that Jesus has risen from the dead. Why would he do that? They don't get anything out of this. They're a persecuted minority for this faith, and yet none of them recant. None of them say, "Oh, we're just kidding. It was all just a story." I mean, you put that all together, and it's like, well, the explanation that Jesus actually did rise from the dead fits pretty well. And then there's other pieces of evidence too. The tomb must have been empty, because the proclamation of the resurrection doesn't happen generations later in other places. It happens in Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, where his tomb was. And it happens right afterwards, like immediately afterwards. Thousands of people are believing in Jesus in Jerusalem. If the tomb wasn't empty, it would have been a very simple thing to say, you guys are ridiculous. Just go look. There's his body. What are you talking about? But it was empty. And then there's the reality that the Gospels portray women as being the first witnesses of the resurrection. Now, we've come a long ways, thankfully, but in the ancient world, women were not considered credible witnesses. You wouldn't believe a story if it was backed up by women. That's how it was in the first century. And yet the Gospel writers record that the women were the first witnesses. Some of you might think, well, that's a 4D chess move to then incorporate them because it makes it seem more realistic. But in the first century, people were going to give this much less of a hearing because of that. If you were making up a story, you would not have told it this way because it damages the credibility of the story to those ears unless it actually happened this way. See, the resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus is not an idea, it's not a myth, it's not a symbol, it's not a warm, fuzzy feeling in our hearts. It is a rugged historical fact for which we actually have as much basis as pretty much anything else, I would argue, in the ancient world. The only thing that would stop, I think, people from believing it is the a priori assumption that things like that just don't happen. But to me, it just fits the evidence. And if there is a God, resurrection isn't going to be a big deal for him. And if you can go with me on that, on the historical reality of the resurrection of Jesus, then here's the next part, okay? The New Testament makes clear that what happened to Jesus will happen to us. Later on in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about how Christ was the first fruits. His resurrection was the first fruits, as in the first of many more to come. In Colossians 1, Paul says that Jesus was the firstborn from the dead, the firstborn, as in there are many more to come. In Philippians chapter 3, Paul says, but our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. So that our bodies will be like his. See, there is this certainty. In biblical faith, there is a certainty about what will happen to us, about our future, about the reality of that, and it's based on what has already happened in the past in Jesus' resurrection. Here's what it is. The historical resurrection of Jesus empowers our endurance in the present because it makes that promise certain. I know I've said a bunch of stuff today. I want to just kind of sum up here as we close, sum up where we've been. We said that the promise of the future empowers our endurance in the present, even in difficult circumstances. We see that in Isaiah 53, in the suffering servant, the promise that he will see descendants, that his days will be prolonged. We see that clearly in Hebrews 12 about Jesus, that he endured the cross, scorned its shame for the joy that was set before him. We see this in the world too. This strategy, public health officials, parenting, whatever. We see that kind of strategy of here's what's to come, here's the reward, just keep going. But we said that loses its power when we start to doubt its promise, when it just seems the goalposts keep on moving, when it seems like we turn a corner and there's another one and another one and another one. And we said that the gospel message, the Easter message, is set apart from the promises of the world because it's not just wishful thinking. It's not just an unfounded hope. It is based on historical reality. It is based on the promise that Jesus has already made manifest in his resurrection. See, I don't know what tomorrow holds. I don't know what the day after that holds. A lot of you know that our family this week is, we're entering into an ordeal, a journey, a medical situation that we've been anticipating for a while, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what this is going to look like. How long are we going to be in the hospital? What are the struggles, the pains, the difficulties that await us? There's a lot of uncertainty about that. We don't know when this pandemic is going to end, when these measures will go away, when we can be together, when we don't need to cover our faces anymore. We don't know when we'll be able to welcome people into our church and worship together without those limitations. We don't know if or when any of these things will happen in our world. But I know this, that Jesus is alive, that Jesus is risen, and that if I trust in him, that I will rise as well, that I will spend eternity in a world without distancing and masks, without sin and brokenness, without despair, without death. that I will spend an eternity with him in a glorious body that will be like his. I know this. And so I set my eyes on him. I set my eyes on his resurrection because it will be mine too. I know that my labor is not in vain. You see, the resurrection of Jesus is not an inspiring story. It is a sure and certain promise of what is to come for you if you trust in him, and that empowers us to endure in the present. Lord Jesus, we come to you today in the midst of a world that feels sometimes like it is coming off the rails. And everything feels like it's up for grabs. Nothing feels certain. Nothing feels solid. We have no idea what's to come, and it can be so disheartening. But Jesus, we are reminded today of the Easter message that you are risen, that you are alive, and that this is a promise, a certain promise of what is to come. Jesus, we know that a day is coming when you will swallow up death forever. We know that a day is coming when you will judge evil and do away with it forever. We know that day is coming. And so I pray, Jesus, for everyone who is with us, I want to pray that you would instill them with a fresh confidence and trust. I pray that you would instill them with a fresh hope. I pray, Lord, that you would send us out from this place praising you and worshiping you because of your victory. Jesus, you are good, you are life, you are glory, you are victory. We give you our lives. Amen.